Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the second new edition of the book that in some respects defines New Europe books. I'm Paul Olchvati, the publisher, and I couldn't be more honored to have the author of this book here, Tomek Yankovsky, as well as John Cox, who will be our moderator today in conversation with Tomek. Tomek, whose bio and John's bio I'll detail in a moment, has a long history in Eastern Europe. And in fact, I happened to cross paths with him many, many years ago. And he worked on this book for many years. And it was soon after New Europe Books itself launched almost a decade ago that his book came to my attention. And this really, it couldn't have been more timely at the time, a popular history of Eastern Europe, and nor could it be more timely today, given everything that is in the news. And really to this day, aside from the wonderful fiction titles that New Europe Books has published, including Romanian-American writer Alta Upland's novel, The Wife Who Wasn't, a brilliant satire that we published last year, upcoming book called Visegrad, a novel by an American longtime expatriate in Eastern Europe, Duncan Robertson, a nonfiction book upcoming next spring called Orbanland, Why Viktor Orban's Hungary Matters, a uniquely objective account of the phenomenon going on in that country and why it's important to the rest of the world for us to know about. Eastern Europe, this more than 700 page, hugely informative and entertaining. It's these two qualities that this book brings together uniquely. Thank you, John. I really can't say enough for it, how much I've fallen in love with it over the years. And it has two forewords now, one by Laszlo Borhi, professor of history at Indiana University, and more recently, for the second edition, one by BBC News Central Europe correspondent Nick Thorpe. And by the way, so as mentioned, this meeting is being recorded, so you can always go back at a future date to view it again. And although John will be in conversation with Tomek, should you have any questions, you can type them into the field at the bottom, the Q&A, and this event will go on for an hour until 5 o'clock. So if we have time, we'll get around to your questions while the event is going on. Otherwise, we will answer them subsequently. And by the way, before I introduce Tomek and John, I must apologize on behalf of my distributor, it seems, for the challenges at the moment of purchasing the book online, but it is available. It's in print, of course, and this will be taken care of within a couple of days, I am sure. Let me introduce first Tomek, and then John, and then I'll hand it over to Tomek, and then we'll get started. So Tomek Yankovsky, he worked, studied, traveled in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary and beyond, starting in the late 1980s. He holds degrees in history and economics. He's the director of a research firm where his reports have often touched on Eastern Europe. He and his wife, his Polish wife, I might add, Magda, live in southern New Hampshire. John Cox is a professor of Eastern European history at North Dakota State University, and he is a leading translator of great literature from Serbo-Croatian, German, and if I'm correct, John, Hungarian?
A little bit, yes.
Okay,
yes.
there are details I'm missing here at the moment because so this is from my memory and from my notes that are in front of me, but please feel free to fill in. So I couldn't have two more qualified people here, of course, the author and John, an eminent scholar. One of his books, by the way, is A History of Serbia. All right, so I'll turn it over now to Tomek.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for taking the time to give me a listen. And if you've read my book, I am deeply grateful. As Paul mentioned, it was about 10 years worth of slogging, but I wrote this because I wanted to answer some basic questions, that I was being asked by a lot of people, but also because it was the book that I wish I had had when I was younger. And I wanted to understand what is Eastern Europe really? That was kind of the basic question, and that's what the book is trying to address. It's one long attempt to define a region and try to understand what does it mean to be Eastern European? What is Eastern Europeanness? Is it an economic disease? Is it a cultural thing? Is it just a border thing, a geographic thing? So this was an attempt to look at a part of the world that is topical nowadays, but is also interesting and connected to other parts of the world in ways that I think a lot of people didn't understand. So, John, I'm so grateful for you taking the time to speak with me today. I know that this is exam week for you, so for North Dakota State University students, if your exams aren't getting done, I apologize. It's all my fault. Let me turn things over to you. And once again, I appreciate you taking the time out.
Oh, by the way, if I may cut in for a moment, because this was, I meant to mention at the beginning, but I'll do so now without further ado. I am also most grateful to New York Books co-publisher, Academic Studies Press, and Matthew Charlton there, who has really been indispensable to the process of getting the second edition published.
Indeed, Matthew and his team have been, Becca, et cetera, they've all been really great and really helpful in getting the second edition out.
Okay, well, I think I will start doing a little of the MC role here. It is a distinct pleasure to be talking about this great, big, wonderful book by my acquaintance and my friend, my colleague, Tomek Yankovsky. This book is one of the, hearing that it had a second edition that was coming out actually made me really happy, because I know that Tomek is an extremely thorough scholar, and I know that Paul is an extremely efficient and effective editor. So I anticipated that the book would be longer and have new material since, depending on how you slice it, since 92 or since at some point after 1989. And indeed, the book does have that. But I also suspected that other parts of the book might be reworked, or things would be changed in more typical second edition ways, and they are. And so it's a delightful product that I hope will be at least as successful as the first edition. The first edition, which I also have here in my office in Fargo, different color and a little bit lighter. I have this first edition because I liked it so much after reading it. I kept it. Not just because I have a thing for books, as anyone who's been in this office will know, but I used this book with my graduate students a few years ago in a course that was based on the first course that I ever taught in my now 32-year teaching career. Was at Indiana University, and it was an undergraduate course at Indiana called Eastern Europe Since Napoleon. If there are any IU people out there, you may remember this course from other professors who taught it. I teach it as a graduate level course here, and Tomek's book, the first edition of Eastern Europe with the exclamation mark, which attracted the students' interest immediately. This was one of about 8 or 9 books that the students had to purchase for the class. It was quite affordable. That definitely wasn't a problem. The students kept the book too because they liked it that much, but I'll tell you why they did in just a second. this is one of those courses that it's a book a week, basically. So there were other readings that weren't in print that the students bought. But I go into detail on that because I had them read Tomek's book in conjunction with, or in comparison to, another one of the standard histories of Eastern Europe. The one that I typically assign for that course is out of print now. I don't know if any of you know this one. Philip Longworth had 2 editions of The Making of Eastern Europe, which is actually the perfect foil for Tomek's book, because the Longworth goes backward to forward, and Tomek's follows, you know, normal chronological order for histories. There are many other differences in the style and the scope of the book, etc. But it made a really convenient back and forth for the first 2 weeks of class. You know, read Longworth or Yankovsky first, and then read the other one, and then we compare and contrast. The students adored Tomek's book, and so I'm pitching for it, obviously, before we have the discussion with the author here. It's a wonderful book for graduate classes if it's paired with other readings as part of a bigger picture thing, and for undergraduate courses. They're not always undergraduate courses that would cover soup to nuts from Eastern Europe, right, from the beginning of time up until Putin and beyond. But the accessibility of the material is delightful, and that isn't to say that it's, quote, an easy book or a short book. It is a passionate book. It is encyclopedic in many ways, but it's supremely well organized. The concepts of it are extremely well thought out. The comparisons and contrasts are often quirky, sometimes amusing, with gentle humor, nothing at anyone's expense. But there are lots of little asides and frankly, little nods to other kinds of European history and world history that students really appreciated. They got the sense very early on from Tomek's book that they were reading something not just by a brilliant writer who is deeply in love with his topic, but also a writer who really cares about them as readers and who wants them to get the most out of the book. So it is a delightful read for general interest in Eastern Europe, people with general interest in Eastern Europe. Also, it's wonderful. It's also a great book for browsing. It's a great book for bouncing from funny story or personal reference to funny story and personal reference. I appreciate the economic insights in it, perhaps more than anything, and that ties in with the author's expertise and his profession. Economics is definitely a weakness of mine, but this book comes through with lots of important charts and tables and comparisons, quantitative and qualitative ones, that make it very, very useful. Okay, so my students and I, Fargo loves this book. I hope that the rest of you will love this book in its 2nd edition. Tomek, are you ready for a question?
Hit me.
All right. Well, on the cover of both editions of your book, it says that we're dealing here with the history of a region that shaped our world and still does. Please talk to us a little bit about how Eastern Europe shaped North Dakota, or I don't know, Tokyo, or Melbourne, anything.
When I started, so my interest in the region began when I was interested in Polish history for kind of obvious reasons. But as I was looking at Polish history, I realized, well, to understand it, I need to understand some German history and some Russian history, some Swedish history, and some Jewish history, and etc. And so I expanded into those. And then when I got into those, I had the same phenomenon. Well, to understand Russian history, I need to understand some Mongolian history, some other Asian history, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I kind of found myself finally at one point looking at this thing called Eastern Europe. What is it? Is it really different? Does it really exist? There are people who will claim it doesn't. And so I began to find the many ways that Eastern Europe is deeply connected to Western and Central European history, to Baltic history, also to the steppe and to Central Asian history and beyond, to the Middle East, to North Africa. So some of it is anecdotal, but there are a lot of ways where the economic story, the story of Eurasia really flows intensely through Eastern Europe. So that to understand, something like the growth and development of Cairo in Egypt, or of the end of the Abbasid Empire, the last great Arab empire in Central Asia and the Middle East, and the rise of the Atlantic states, facing states in Western Europe, you need to have a grounding in what's going on in Eastern Europe. It's all a part of that story. So it wasn't an attempt to find these connections. It was that I found it difficult to not be able to tell the stories of these different parts of the world without understanding something of Eastern Europe.
Okay. Very, very, very well put. So when you talk about Eastern Europe in these global history connections, this is not necessarily Slavic Eastern Europe. This could be pre-Slavic Eastern Europe. And it's not necessarily Orthodox or Roman Catholic Christian Eastern Europe. Could be the pre-Christian era as well, right? So, I mean, I think a lot of us, certainly if you do political science or anthropology of today's Balkans, I do 20th century history. So we tend to think of everything as very recent, maybe something as far back as Napoleon might be as far back as we tend to think. But you, in your thinking and analysis of the region, you want to take this way back, way back.
I'm looking for those flows of history, whether it's economic flows, cultural flows, technology flows. You know the city of Sigdunum pretty well, John, don't you?
Yes.
Modern Belgrade, I think they call it nowadays, locals. So it's interesting to think when you look at something like the amber trade from the Baltic Sea, where you can find amber from the Neolithic, the early Neolithic, so the late Stone Age. You can find Baltic amber in the graves of the people in Britain who built Stonehenge, and in the tombs of pharaohs in Egypt, and in the Middle East, in ancient Syria and the Mesopotamia region. So there were these trade networks that have moved and existed across borders that seem kind of bizarre today. So, you think of how is it that there are so many Roman finds discovered in Poland today? Roman coins, Roman artifacts, when Poland is nowhere near the ancient Roman borders. Well, it's because of that amber trade network. There's ancient pre-Islamic Arab silver in northern Germany and the Baltic coast that dates from this trade. So the connections again that I was following led me. I couldn't find that point where they simply sprang up in the last 200 years, or were relatively recent. These stories are old, and they're really the European and the Eurasian story.
Okay, so your great passion for this region and for these many, this bouquet of topics here, this led you to be a sleuth. I mean, you're doing detective work about, you notice these trends, and then you want to come to their to get an extent of just how extensive they were, and see what kind of documentation is out there for them. Did you come across any interesting trends that you wish you could have followed for the book, but that didn't have a documentary source, or you didn't have time, or in other words, if there's a third edition and you have room for something from the 7th century AD or BC, what would it be?
First of all, yes, doing research on this topic and on these topics is the story of rabbit holes. You're going down lots of rabbit holes, and in a lot of those rabbit holes, you find brick walls. Absolutely. So there, as I described it, a lot of the feedback I get from readers over the years, which I really enjoy, has been, you mentioned this topic. It's so interesting. Why didn't you go into it deeper? Because I'm covering, it's already 1,500 years. We're already at 750 pages. I can't, I leave the door open for you to pursue those. But there are so many different stories. There's a wonderful story from the mid-18th century, and I finally did shoehorn in a useless trivia, a little boxed off section on it in the second edition. But it'd be wonderful to write a book on this itself. about the vampirism hysteria that swept through the Habsburg Empire, beginning in the Serbian lands. The Habsburgs, of course, being who they were, they kept wonderful records about all this and the sheer panic and the story, how the story unfolds and how they came to realize that the anti-vampirism practices a lot of these remote villages were doing was actually spreading the contagion of whatever was leading to all these people dying. It's a wonderful story, fascinating story, and it's a story of it's a detective story, and there's a particular scientist who finally put all the pieces together. And I think Hollywood, if you're listening, guys, there's a great script out there for this. So, but that I think is one of the many stories that definitely deserve digging deeper into.
Very nice, very nice. Well, we look forward to that. Although you can write a different. Well, that can go in your next book, whatever it is, for sure. While we're on big issue topics like this, I have one more sort of macro question. We're talking about global history here and the long scope of your research. What about the regions within Eastern Europe? I know there's no end to the grief that you must get calling some countries Eastern Europe, period, referring to some countries as Balkans or not, etc. So feel free to go into which countries are what if you wish. But more than that, I'm interested in how many regions within Eastern Europe do you see? I recall that in edition 1, you have about 5 regions, maybe. You didn't just have the Central Europe and the Balkans. You had the Baltics maybe singled out, and then some post-Soviet states or CIS or something as a 4th category. So maybe it was just 4. And you had Germany in with Central Europe, which is problematic for many people. But tell us about you and the sub-regions in your chosen area, sir.
So yeah, this is a really contentious piece, and for all the hate email we're going to get, send it to John, please. I use the regions that in the book that were the most commonly known or used. So I looked for those categories that were tossed around the most, even if they weren't understood very well. Everyone, you hear the Balkans, this term, the Balkans turn around, the Baltics, you hear about Central Europe. My job, as I saw it, wasn't to definitively say, here's the line, this is in, this is out. I had on a podcast I was on it a few weeks ago, someone asked kind of a similar question, but they prefaced it with, and we know, of course, that Croatia and Slovenia are not Balkan countries, right? They are Central Europe, right? You agree on that? And I'm not going to answer that now, as I did not then. But I think the interesting thing when you get into this question about the different regions is less where the lines, because that's what everyone's concerned about. And part of the problem is a lot of these names have negative connotations attached to them. Nobody brags about being Eastern European. We did have actually a mutual acquaintance and a friend of ours, Gazi Kapliani, once told me he's Albanian and somewhat a very gifted writer. Whom people should check out. He told me, I've never thought of myself as Eastern European. I'm Balkan. Where those lines are is very different depending on who you're talking to. What's interesting about Eastern Europe in this sense is that this regionalization and the local variations of region and culture are a really interesting place to look at how identity developed in Europe as a whole. And there's a lot you can extrapolate because state institutional development was weaker historically in Eastern Europe. And so these regions are more important in a lot of ways. The languages, the cultures, the religious identity points, all these elements are more important there. And so it's a great place to look and see how Europeans historically have developed their sense of who they are, their identities, the notion of nation states, and these very clear boundaries between peoples, despite the fact that even in Western Europe, there are some gray areas. There are some odd areas like Lower Saxon along the Dutch border, which is a German dialect, which quite frankly is, in my mind, comes a lot closer to Standard Dutch than it does to Hochdeutsch, the Standard German. So you get to see some of that messiness becomes a little clearer when you look at Eastern Europe.
Okay, okay. The you know, but I'm just thinking. I want to drill down just a little bit on at least the idea of Central Europe,
Okay.
which is probably the regional designation from the eastern half of the continent that is least likely to spark objections from people. And in part, that is because of its association with the Habsburg Empire, for better and for worse, as opposed to the Ottoman or Russian empires from pre-1918, 1917. But it's also been the subject throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? It was the subject of this famous set of correspondence and essays and polemics and wonderful rhetorical statements by everyone from Czesław Miłosz to Danilo Kish, right? Milan Kundera, George Konrad, all kinds of people weighed in on what it meant to be Central European. And it was especially sort of drenched in Cold War, the necessity of being on one side or the other politically, and where does that leave culture sort of hanging and blowing in the wind? I mean, do you think that there is regardless of how other people approach from the outside, do you think that there is at least a Central European spirit, maybe not tied to a full state or to any particular demographic arrangement, but is there a Central European spirit? And if so, is it as positive as a lot of people thought it was in the Cold War?
Okay, I've got all sorts of jokes going through my mind right now about fatty foods. I'm gonna put those aside. Yes. So Eastern Europe as a whole has been defined in the negative. It's not so much what it is, but from the outside, from those who began using this term, what they were saying really is this is not core Europe. This isn't the real Europe. Yeah, it's technically part of Europe, but it's a part of that Europe, or it's that sort of the periphery Europe. But this is all driven by the massive changes that the Atlantic-facing parts of Europe underwent, beginning in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It's not just that they underwent this huge transformation that was both shared, but it was global. They globalized that world that they created. There was a part of Europe that was not a part of that, and Central Europe, in many respects, is where that Europe begins. And German, I use the term nationalist, but that's kind of a charged term. As German national consciousness arose over the 19th century, that was kind of the foothold of where they began, looking at this idea, Mitteleuropa, and they tried to set aside this separate area. It wasn't Western, it wasn't that Atlantic-facing world, but it wasn't the East. The East, of course, is Asian, barbaric, et cetera, et cetera. It was this notion that there is this European culture, this Europeanness, that is not as connected to the rest of the world as both Southern Europe and Western Europe were. I think that identity really has taken hold, and it's moved beyond, as you said, the Habsburg Empire helped spread that notion, not intentionally, but just through shared commonality of economic and social and cultural experiences, architecture, etc. So that yeah, I think I think it really was a reality. And while there was a political point behind the authors that you mentioned, and I quote Miłosz and Kundera from some of the writings that they have from that period, but there really is a commonality that they were struggling to define, that defied, as you said, at the time there was a very little wall cutting Europe in half. And they were talking about these experiences that transcended that. The fact that you can go to places like Novi Sad in Serbia and yet see this, beautiful Art Nouveau architecture, and there's the foods. There's also certain cultural expectations. There really is a Central Europe, but how much does it extend to Eastern France, Switzerland, Northern Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, Hungary, etc.? That's where all the fistfights and barroom brawls began.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Maybe we'll get some questions on this particular point. I do have just one more regional thing, and then we'll switch to more livelier topics. Do you want to take a stab at defining the Balkans? Again, not with individual countries. We'll let you off that hook. I'm happy to do that in an email if anybody wants to write me. Here's the thing. I mean, maybe I'll do some of the heavy lifting for you, and if you want to ride this wave, you can, but you don't have to. Is not a lot of what we call Balkans in terms of cultural and political characteristics, do these not simply reach us today through the simple social facts of Eastern Orthodoxy and the presence of the Ottoman Empire? I mean, if we look at areas that are technically part of the European landmass, be they islands or be it the continent itself, and we look at overlapping zones where Ottoman influence and Eastern Orthodoxy overlapped at different times, sort of in absolute value, do we not see that as at least one matrix that provides us with a lot of fundamental characteristics of the Balkans? And that being said, I don't view the term Balkans as negative at all. I've devoted my life to its study, and now increasingly I do these literary translations. I love the region, and I love studying the region. And but if people prefer to call it Southeastern Europe, I think that's hunky-dory. It doesn't matter to me. But the point is, also, I think in defining any region, maybe any region outside of Europe too. I tend to think of this only in the US or in European case, but actually with the US, with our regions, like what is the South or what is Appalachia, we have to take this approach too. Why in Eastern European history do people feel the need to assign entire cultures or states to a certain region? Why can we not go at a more granular level, region by region? So why can we not say, for instance, that Vojvodina is Central Europe and Šumadija in southern Serbia is Balkans? Why does it have to be all of Serbia, right? Why does it, I mean, people draw a distinction but in Romanian studies between the Transylvanian culture, which is not purely Romanian, obviously, a mixture of 3 or 4 important cultures, with the more monochromatically Romanian from Moldavia and Wallachia, right? So if we like in the United States, I went to Indiana University. Southern Indiana is, well, not like Northern Indiana, right? But they're all Hoosiers. But do we have to say that they are all Midwestern or that they're all Appalachian? No, isn't it kind of a regional thing? I don't know. How does that make you feel?
Well, first of all, I've got some questions about Indiana now. I think that, so I'll go back to the beginning. I think you're right that when outside of the region, when people use this term Balkans, they're pretty much referring to that former post-Ottoman, mostly Christian Orthodox, although as you know, that you certainly know the story on the ground is a lot more complicated than that. But those are the basic traits that they're looking at. When I was towards the end of the working on the first edition, I was towards the end of the project, and a book came out that I don't know, it's just one of those books you trip across, and it was by James Scott, and it's called The Art of Not Being Governed: An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. This may sound totally out of left field, but one of the reasons that it was influential is it didn't look at and I know nothing about the history of Southeast Asia, but it approached the history not from the state-centric point. Here's Vietnam, here's Laos, here's Cambodia or Cambodia. It was a history of the peoples, and it drew a distinction between the upland peoples, the peoples who lived in the higher elevations, and how history looked to them versus the people in the lowlands, and those are the people who formed the states and had the more sophisticated economic ties and that type of thing. And I saw something very similar in Eastern Europe. Patrice Domorovsky just came out with a book on the Carpathians, and she talks about how when you get up into the upper levels, and this is something that I experienced while living there, the distinction between Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Romanians, and a whole plethora of smaller name groups of peoples that most of you probably have never heard of. The distinctions between these really grays out from in terms of the music, the culture, the organization, the local social organizations. So I think when I look at a place like the Balkans, it's what for me. What's interesting is how central it has been to European history. There was a time when, as I mentioned in both editions, the Balkans were core and central to the Roman world. Britain was not. Britain was very much a periphery state, a border state that required lots of resources to organize and to protect. But Sirmium, Pannonia, this was heartland stuff. So uh, I think defining the Balkans is less about looking at the countries that exist in the ground and their histories that are part of that, and more at looking at, I have a section, as you know, on prehistory in the region, how farming technologies are basically entered in Europe through the Balkans and went up the Danube and spread that way. Metallurgy, the various levels of metal technology basically came from the Near East or from Central Asia and spread, westward into Europe through the Balkans primarily. It's a place that is incredibly complicated on the ground. DNA technologies are opening doors that we didn't know about just how central the Balkans were, and not just for Central European and that history, but there were a lot of sea peoples who moved from the Balkans to Italy, to southern France, southern Spain historically. So the Balkans are the plug for Europe into what was going on for the rest of Eurasia. And that for me is the definitive element. If you love history, if you want to go to a place where you can see some of the earliest architecture or city structures in Europe, and you also want to see Roman history, Byzantine history, Ottoman history, Italian history, Savoy and Anjou and the great French dynasties, some of their history, Spanish history, this all plays out in the Balkans. German history, there are imprints of these peoples and more, the Celts, others, Illyrians, Dacians, that just make it an incredibly interesting place. And it shows in the foods, the culture, the history today, the architecture, everything. So that for me is, when I think of Balkans, that's what comes to mind. It's a place of origins and a place where there are so many footprints that would prove influential to what happens later in Paris, Berlin, London, and elsewhere.
Well, as a Balkanist, I love that image there, your approach, and I will note that you're in very good company with a long list of anthropologists and literary scholars and others looking at how Greek culture, classical Greek culture, right, fed off of its Balkan location and how it spread into Europe that way also. And the Balkans as the first Europe, etc., by Trajan Stojanovic. So you're in very good company. You're in very good company. It's hard.
Wait a minute. You didn't just call Greece Balkan, did you? Is that on the record?
I did, but I'm gonna get letters. But okay. It's Balkan environment, I said. That's all. So obviously your passion is great. Your skills as a sleuth and as a writer are refined. Tell us about one of the tools that serious historians and economic scholars need, and that would be your languages. How did you learn your languages from this region? And does there remain any East European language that you would love to still learn for new projects? Because you know several or many already, yes?
So started with Polish, and in part that came from the family, but that's something that I pursued after, in my adult life as well. And then when you marry a Pole, things happen. I guess it was helpful knowing Polish just because of the Slavic language, having access to a Slavic language and kind of the basic grammatical logic and the lexicon opens doors for you. There are limits. I have a tragic story that took place in the Zagreb train station once when I tried to use my Southern Slavified Polish to order train tickets and discovered that listopad, which is November in Polish, is actually October in Serbian and Croatian. But it does open doors. I have started, some years back, I started learning Bulgarian as well. And just because it's so fascinating from a Slavic language standpoint. But it's clear we back in the late 80s and early 90s when I was living in Hungary, you had to learn Russian, of course, for political reasons, and I found it very accessible. Probably more so than many Poles would like to admit, in fact. So speaking a Slavic language is definitely any Slavic language is a great place to start if you want to study the region. I ended up in Hungary completely by accident and ended up learning Hungarian. And in fact, my Hungarian teacher today is, I'm very proud that he's involved with the opposition movement Momentum. That was interesting because it took me not just out of the Slavic context, but Hungarian is a Finno-Ugric language, isn't even an Indo-European language. So it is a totally different world from what most other European languages and how they function. And that was very eye-opening. But it also gave me access to, because of, I had to study some of the philology a little bit. So a little bit of Turkish, a little bit of Finnish, just because of some of the ancient linguistic relationships. But quite frankly, it's just a fun language. So those are the two languages I'm most comfortable in. I try to maintain Hungarian through lovely, the internet is a wonderful place. I have a little smattering, as I mentioned, of Russian and German as well. Nobody's going to confuse me with a native speaker with either of those two, but I can read a newspaper article fairly comfortable on either of those. And the last part, I am just now, ich lerne Yiddish. So I'm just starting to learn Yiddish. And the reason is that for years, for anyone who's, and you've experienced this as well, just traveling around the region, you'll see older buildings and maybe some of the plaster will have broken off, and beneath you'll see old street signs or business signs, and they'll be in German or often in Yiddish. And there are parts of the region where there are still these residual elements of that really once vibrant Jewish culture, Ashkenazi culture. In Kraków in Poland, there's a part of the city called Kazimierz that still has a very active Jewish culture today. But walking around, you'll see like these wonderful turn of the 20th century iron gates into courtyards. And you have to look for it, but there'll be little signs like little stars of David or little Yiddish or Hebrew biblical Torah statements. So these little hints of a world that used to exist are all over, and it's always been opaque to me. It's always been something I couldn't access. So Duolingo, free ad for anyone. It's a online program if you want to start a language. They have a paying side, but there's a free side. I'm starting to learn Yiddish there and learning the alphabet to start the first step. I look forward to having greater access. And I contacted some Yiddish scholars for this work, particularly for the second edition. There were a few things in there I wanted to understand, and they pointed me towards some resources as well. But it's still a living culture, but clearly with the Holocaust, it's so difficult to explain just what was lost, the magnitude of the change of the ethnic and the cultural landscape of so many, particularly Central European cities.
Tomek, John, I popped back in here not because we only have about 15 minutes left, but because there are a couple of questions I was hoping to get in, and I know John.
Good, take it away. Take it. You're the boss.
These questions as well, but so I'll ask them at the same time or one after another, and then. So one, of course, Ukraine and that big question mark of will Russia invade Ukraine, and what does that even mean if it does happen? That's one question, the potential implications of that happening or not happening and to the region and
Did that come from
whether
a guy named Zelensky?
maybe. And of course, is NATO membership for Ukraine even has it even been seriously considered or realistic? So that's a rather pressing question because this is something that is unfolding in the coming weeks and months. The other one that, well, as has the conflict in Ukraine been going on for some years, the question of Hungary and Poland, Budapest and Warsaw, being the in the eyes of many in the EU, particularly some of the EU's Western states, and in the eyes of many elsewhere in the world, are misbehaving, so to speak. What does this mean? Does this mean that prospects of the EU expanding will diminish over time? Might another country be leaving the EU at some point in the next couple to 5 years? Even if that does happen, as long as it's not Germany, France, or Italy, does it matter a whole lot? So 2 questions. Take it from there.
Okay, the Ukraine question. So will Putin invade? Great question. If I did know the definitive answer to that, a lot of intelligence agencies would probably be reaching out to me. My sense is that Putin and in the second edition, so I added a chapter on what has happened in the region since the fall of the communist regimes, pretty much up to the present. And of course, that means having to talk about Putin a lot and what his Russia looks like today. My sense is that he's playing a weak hand, and he is. The truth is if the West, did want to add Ukraine to NATO, he wouldn't be able to stop it. This is pretty much he's pulling out all the stops as to how much influence he's got. This is about as far as he can take it, as short of actually invading Ukraine. My argument is that the problem is, it's a problem for Ukraine. We've got a big problem now. But it's really a bigger problem from Russia. I saw some polls recently, and it came through Radio Free Europe, which is fairly critical of Putin. So take that with a grain of salt. But they ran their own polls in Russia on how would you react to Putin invading Ukraine, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 0.25% said it would be a positive thing for Russia to do this among Russians. This is Russians in Russia. So my sense is that I have a strong disagreement with Putin over what is valuable for Russia, what would be beneficial for Russia in the larger sense, not just in terms of what his policies towards Ukraine are. And I think this is just a continuation of his worldview, which is outdated and dangerous, but also doing a lot of damage to Russia, to its economic prospects, to how the average Russian is able to live day to day. They're paying the price for this through lack of development, through still having some of the lowest living standards in Europe. And it's for a policy that isn't really buying Russia or Putin anything more than simply prestige. So I'll stop there. I go into some detail there in the chapter on Russia, particularly talking about his relationship with China as well. I go into some depth there because there's some important dynamics that are shifting that are not beneficial for Russia in that relationship. And I think it's worth thinking about as the world as a whole is dealing, kind of grappling with the rise of China and what that means, and how should China be integrated into the world economy, into the world political scene. And that part of that story is playing out in Eastern Europe. with Serbia, for instance, at the moment in a prominent way, with Montenegro, with Orban's Hungary. So it's an important thing to explore, but that's another story. It's a larger story. As far as should NATO expand into Ukraine, I'll try to be really brief here. I know we're coming up on time, but my sense is, number one, Europe has been trying for 200 years, going back to the Concert of Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, to create some sort of pan-European security understanding or system, the goal of which is not to so much to create alliances, but to simply stop wars in Europe, or at least to stop the big ones. And the only one so far that's had any measure of success has been NATO. And there are a lot of reasons for why they don't work, but NATO's really gone a long way towards harmonizing the militaries of the countries, creating the sort of communications and cooperation and logistical cooperation that's important. But it's also, and in Eastern Europe, this is particularly important, it has helped professionalize the relationship between the militaries and the civilian governments. Eastern Europe in the 20th century has a lot of history of militaries in Romania and Poland in particular, but elsewhere, of the military becoming involved in politics in insidious ways, sometimes just plain overthrowing the government, and also influencing national policies. So NATO has helped control a lot of that, and in that sense, it's deeply benefited Russia. Does that mean there are obvious historic reasons that Russians would never want to join NATO, and they should be concerned about having a border with NATO? But my sense is that in a perfect world, any sort of European security arrangement, why would you throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of the one security system that has worked all of this time? Russia could find some sort of accommodation and work with NATO. If the real concern was security in Ukraine for Russia, then there are some very practical ways that can be dealt with through negotiation with the West, with NATO, I'm going down a rabbit hole here on that. This is an important element that I think distorts a lot of how the news reports about what's happening with Putin, with Ukraine, with Russia. Quite frankly, I think he just has an old imperial mindset. He's thinking in 19th century terms. If anyone sat down and really thought about, well, what are Russia's security needs, legitimate security needs, and how should it address them? I don't think Putin's policies would be anything close to the sort of logical conclusions you would come to. So I'll stop there. As far as the next question that you asked, let's see, so Poland and Hungary, these are really close to my heart. I've got family in Poland, and I've certainly got a lot of good friends and colleagues in Hungary. I'm on the record, and in the book, I certainly make this clear that I'm opposed to the policies of the Orban government in Hungary, and I call it the Kaczynski government in Poland. He's technically in charge, even though he doesn't really have a position that says he's in charge. He's really just a member of parliament. But I don't care about left wing or right wing in politics. That really isn't meaningful. I don't think it describes much of and in a helpful way of what the real problems are on the ground in Europe or anywhere, quite frankly. My problem is just that they're anti-democratic, that they are undermining democracy and the relative free markets that I think have benefited the region so much. So I think the European Union has a right to draw a line in the sand. As Paul, you and I have talked about, the European Union's discovering it never expected to have this problem, and it doesn't really know how to deal with them. It doesn't have a mechanism for dealing with these. And in the earlier incarnations, pre-Treaty of Maastricht, European Union and the old European Economic Community, there were several dictatorships. There was Greece, there was Portugal, there was Spain. This is kind of a new problem, and the European Union needs to think about that. How to address this. in a meaningful way. And I think democracy needs to be a cornerstone of the European Union. Quite frankly, the European Union is the sanest thing Europe has ever done. Yes, there's issues with execution, well, with how some of the policies have been formulated, et cetera. And we can go back to d'Estaing's disaster with the European Constitution. But I think that Europe needs to find a way to address what's going on in Hungary and Poland. Are some of the countries going to leave? I doubt it. Britain has some very particular, unique local circumstances that I think don't apply. So while there are exit type movements throughout the European Union, the truth is it's really had a very big impact over the past 20 years in living standards and in making business easier to do across the European Union in a way that the smaller markets, even in France and Germany, quite frankly, the financial markets are very locally focused, regionally focused, not very well developed for helping local businesses expand outside into the rest of the world. The financial infrastructure is not that developed as it is in the UK, for instance, or the US or China or Japan. So the European Union has played a big role in helping local business, helping local economy. Certainly has some fall downs on the political side, but even Hungary probably is the most likely. Orban probably is the most likely to want to leave. But even there, I think, and Paul, you definitely would have an opinion on this. I think there's certainly among people of our generation, remember Hungary getting into the European Union. I think there'd be so much outrage. Poland, it's just not thinkable.
Yeah, certainly if there were to be a referendum, I can guess what the outcome would be. And so at the moment, I don't think that's much a big issue.
Yeah, Poland, the Kaczynski government threw a tantrum about a month ago and kind of alluded to, well, maybe we'll just leave. There was an instant, very visceral grassroots reaction against it. So that it just that's not gonna
we're down to the wire time-wise, although we won't be cut off at 5 o'clock. Does anyone have any objections to going 5 minutes beyond, because we have 2 questions that came in? I don't know if
Sure.
Okay, one question, both of them by anonymous attendees. In researching the numerous avenues of historical events for the book, what were some of your best resources? And given some of the political landscape of the region, how did you combat any misinformation?
That's a great question. So what I did, and keep in mind, we talked about the languages. I only speak a couple languages well enough to really be doing something serious in them. And then a couple others I have some smattering of, and I have like my Romanian is tourist Romanian. Where is this? How much is that? That type of thing. So what I did is I went to the scholars, widely known and accepted scholars, and went through their bibliographies and looked for their works, and then followed them through JSTOR and through academic avenues to be able to read some of the papers they were publishing as well. And in some cases, I quite frankly reached out to people, and including some very well-known scholars, and asked them for help with some of the thornier issues. I reached out to a well-known British archaeologist, for instance, who's an expert on Slavic archaeology, on the foundations of the Polish state, and he gave me kicked me towards a few resources that were very helpful, people, and a couple papers that were very helpful. So it was relying on, now it's, from the English-speaking perspective, Eastern Europe's kind of a narrow subject. So there were a short list of people I could deal with here. I had colleagues and friends in Hungary who were helpful, and to a certain degree in Poland as well. But basically it was following in their tracks and using the resources they did, and then leaving from those resources, branching out. The misinformation, as anywhere, there's nationalism, and there were nationalist texts. I have a copy of a book here somewhere, written by a Hungarian living in the US during World War II, and he's trying to tell the history of Hungary. But he starts out, the very first line is, Hungary is an Aryan nation, clearly showing his pro-German sympathies there. That kind of stuff is everywhere. You have it here in the US, you have it everywhere. And you just have to be able to filter, quite frankly, and look for the resources and understand how those resources are read, how they're interpreted, and what they mean, and what they don't say as much as what they say.
Okay, we're just about done here, but very quickly, in connection with current events in Ukraine, thanks, by the way, Tomek, for that answer. Should Putin decide to go forward with aggression against Ukraine, so if he does, as you understand it, would the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances force NATO to respond to assist Ukraine? May this already have been passed over or ignored when Crimea was annexed?
If you ask a Ukrainian, most of them will say yes, exactly. The Budapest Memorandum should have applied, according to them, beginning with Crimea, beginning with then the seizure of eastern Ukraine. Clearly, that shows the limits of what the United States and the West are willing to do for Ukraine. But I do think it sounds like they will be doing some other things, probably some things that we will know about, some sanctions, economic sanctions, those types of things that will cause some pain for Putin. There are probably other things as well on the cyber security front that we will probably will never hear about. I think when Putin, when he invaded Georgia in 2008, I read it as a demonstration of, it was a message to Georgians and to the region of, you are not going to join NATO, the West is not coming, we can do to you what we want. They also, the Russian Air Force very pointedly targeted economic assets in Georgia that had received Western investment. So there was a clear message there. I think Putin can't go that far with Ukraine. I think he's kind of up against the ropes there. But he's trying to send that same message to Kiev, saying, you know, the West isn't going to come save you. They're never going to let you into NATO. They don't trust you. So you need to deal with us. And I think that's the message. We'll see how far this goes and who's pushing what buttons. But
thanks, Tomek. I will ask the last question, but I'll ask that in closing because it's such an easy question. At least I assume it will be. I'll hold you in suspense for a moment, but before I'll let you close with that question and then we'll say goodbye. But before I ask that last question, I just want to thank both of you again from the bottom of my hearts. And I, in addition to acknowledging the assistance of New Europe Books co-publisher, Academic Studies Press, again, and Matthew and Becca there. I also want to acknowledge the vital assistance of New Europe Books associate, publishing associate, Magdalena Bartkowska, whose name is there. Feel free to come in on video, Magda. Hi. So, and well, it was a wonderful discussion. John, Tomek, thank you. And so last question from the audience was, what is your favorite Eastern European food, Tomek?
Okay.
We can go until 5:30, but.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if my wife is listening, then that means there's an answer I have to give. So for the first edition, my wife very helpfully provided a pierogi recipe. And in fact, in a week, there's gonna be a bunch of Poles in my kitchen making pierogi factory style. But for the second edition, she provided a recipe for a Baltic food called bigos, which is absolutely wonderful winter dish. Unfortunately, it'll give you gas. It'll probably do ugly things to your cholesterol, but it is an awesome winter food, great for keeping the belly and your central core warm, and those cold winter nights.
Thank you, Tomek, and thanks everyone. It was a pleasure. And so once again, this book will be easily available for order shortly. So if you encounter any challenges out there on Amazon or anywhere else, keep in mind if you run into any problems and your order is canceled, send an email to paul@neweuropebooks.com, and I'll just let you know within the next couple of days when these problems have been resolved. So our distributor is on top of this. Thank you.
John, Paul, Magda, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Bye-bye.